Hey, what's up, everybody? Today I'm talking with somebody I met on Discord who goes by the name Christian Anarchist. Welcome, man. How's it going?
It's going well, thanks.
Going good. All right.
Yeah.
So we were debating on whether to put your name up as your actual name or your Discord name, but we decided it's important because we want to touch on the anarchy thing. And I was just saying previously that I may end up steering the ship more towards a political episode, if it goes that way, just because I do end up talking about Christianity a lot on the show, because I'm typically talking about spirituality or religion. Um, and so, yeah, I just, obviously Christianity is one of the most popular thoughts in the world. So just end up with a lot of them, which is fine. It's great. And it always amazes me actually how different each type of Christian is too. So, um, anyway, without further ado, would you mind just sort of giving us all an introduction of yourself? You can be detailed or share as little or as much as possible.
I'm Christian anarchist, I guess that's what I go by on Discord. I am really a Christian and really an anarchist. I tend to be uh, more of the left-leaning variety of anarchists. So I'm what you would call an anarcho-syndicalist. So I just believe in workplace democracy, basically. Um, and at the same time, I am very theologically conservative, as they call it. Not conservative. So when we say theologically conservative, we tend not to mean like in the political sense, right? It just means that we take the Bible seriously. So I'm not like because a lot of people might who are anarchists might be like Christian in a bit more of a cultural sense, but I am more. I'm not saying that like throwing any shade their way. I'm just saying I'm not that, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I tend to be I'm non-denominational, but I tend to be more Protestant leaning on a lot of different issues. Um, and that should probably get you the general vibe of what I'm all about, I guess.
Yeah. Cool. So first time hearing anarcho, did you say syndicalism? Like syndicate, uh, or what did you say?
Yeah, anarcho-syndicalism.
Okay.
So it, it's basically like workers' co-ops, workplace democracy, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So what I just briefly Googled, it's talking sees labor unions as something which will cause revolutionary change. But ultimately, you would like to see, I guess, a society that gets rid of like wage labor, and like this capital system, I guess.
Eventually, yeah. I mean, you could always push for like a cashless sort of society, I guess, but uh, it's not a necessary step on the way to anarchism, in my view. It's just something that would be a good goal um, to head towards, I guess.
Well, I guess even if you didn't get rid of the cash itself, just sort of the wage labor relation to like capital owners type thing.
Mm.
Okay. So as far as social issues, I guess, because I've noticed lately that people are starting to use anarchy in like social ways. I don't know if you've noticed this. In the sense that they'll be like, I'm a relationship anarchist or I'm a gender anarchist, which basically just boils down to like nonconformity, I guess, in these systems. Uh, have you thought about that at all? Do you care? Are you mostly just in the economic sense?
Well, yeah, I'm a bit old-fashioned. I'm mostly a economic kind of anarchist and like a I guess a political one. Well, I guess it's all political, but like, yeah, like more against like the notion of government. I do understand, like, for example, when we're talking about queer anarchism or gender anarchism, there's like a specific history about what that means because I do believe that there is a meaningful critique of social hierarchies. One thing that I've sort of noticed within anarchist circles is that there'll be some anarchists who want to abolish, like, you know, hierarchies in business, hierarchies in government, and that's awesome. But they tend to want to replace it almost with a kind of hierarchy that's like a social hierarchy, almost like a clique, right? Where it's like,
Mm,
there's like a kind of social agreement that we all abide by, and it functionally, even if it's a lot better than the alternative, ends up being like a kind of, it's almost like like in high school when you had all those little cliques and groups, like
yeah,
almost treating them as like classes, and like you have like the popular kids as the ruling class or something. It's almost
yeah,
like society be run like that, and I'm still against that. So if the social kinds of anarchists like are like attacking specific social hierarchies in that sense, all for it. I think that's interesting work. And I do think we need to be as critical as of social hierarchies as we are of any other hierarchy, really.
yeah, yeah. That's well put. I've actually been thinking about it a lot because I generally don't like hierarchical structures, um, especially just obviously more exploitative ones that have like an authoritarian side and a lesser. Um, but I've been thinking like I don't actually think you can get fully away from hierarchy in a sense. Just how you were describing the social cliques thing, it seems like naturally the like popular person or whoever it may be would even if they didn't want to, they would sort of take a leadership role in a group of people. Um so I don't know, maybe you disagree. Like do you think that you can actually not have any hierarchy at all in that sense?
Well, that's not really the way I tend to approach it. Like, I don't. My view of anarchism isn't just the absence of hierarchy, but rather the presence of freedom of association, right? So, for example, right, if I'm walking down the street and I see a Pilates class type thing going on, right, and I look in the window and I see people doing Pilates or whatever, um, technically, there's a hierarchy going there in the sense that you have the Pilates instructor, and then you have all the people in that class following the directions of that Pilates instructor, right? And
Hmm.
technically, that's a hierarchy. But even amongst, I mean, you might
Hmm.
get some anarchists that are like this, but usually we're not really concerned about abolishing that. There doesn't really
Right.
seem to be any issue going on there. But the key reason for that is because the relationship is entirely well, presumably entirely consensual.
Right.
Nobody's freedom of association is being taken away. The specific hierarchies I want to critique are the ones that take away freedom of association either by a monopoly on the use of violence or a monopoly on the means of production, which is why I do tend to lean a bit more economic, as I mentioned before, while still acknowledging that social hierarchies. I do think there's the only hierarchies that I think can exist in any meaningful way would be social hierarchies that are purely consensual and that anyone could back out of at any time. So like I would sort of build it up around a sense of like what is freedom of association, and any hierarchy that attacks that right is illegitimate in my view.
Okay. Um, so what would be your response to sort of a, I guess, classic capitalist argument against a system like this? And actually, I think you could maybe even find some progressive or even communist system argument just as far as production goes. So the capitalist mindset is that this free trade, this competition is very good, right? Even if we sort of have to exploit some labor. I don't know if they'd admit to that, but um it's leading to things like us going to the moon. It's leading to all this ingenuity, all of this technological advance, the betterment of more and more people and families because of the competition, which by the way, yeah, I'm not a capitalist. I'm just trying to get your response to it. Um, so yeah, in an anarchist system, I guess how would advancement like this, like scientific advancement, technological advancement, all of that, how would that look?
Well, if you, I guess the first transition stage that would, when it comes to the system that I advocate for, would be starting off by basically taking all the businesses that we already have and turning them into workers' cooperatives, right? So because you would still, I mean, have businesses essentially. You'd still have markets even. There was, I mean, at least for now, I guess, as like a transition stage. Whether you consider that anarchism or not, is sort of beside the point in the sense that it's still just a transition along the way to the final point. Um, but like you would still have like businesses that would innovate, and you would even have better incentive to innovate if you're working in a workers co-op than if you were just working for a wage at just some company. Because I've actually studied HR at university, and one of the biggest problems in HR is in the sense of workers' motivation is how do you get people to work so that they're not just working for the wage, that they're not just working just hard enough not to get fired, and then they get the wage and leave. How do we get them to put in 110%? And that's when we get into things like intrinsic motivation as opposed to just pure extrinsic motivation, just pure
Mm,
wages and benefits and holidays. And like over and over and over again, the literature bears out that intrinsic motivation and being able to have really good intrinsic motivation is far superior to any extrinsic motivation you could ever pull. And the three top intrinsic motivating sort of forces are autonomy, relatedness, and competence, I believe is the third one. And those are all technical terms in what's called self-determination theory. And
mm,
so under a workers co-op sort of arrangement, it hits all three of those really, really, really well so that workers are intrinsically motivated to be able to bring their best every day and extrinsically motivated because if they own portions of the company, they get more money the more profitable the business is, rather than just getting a flat wage regardless of how well they do. So there's much more of a direct connection between their performance and the benefits they see from that.
yeah. Um, well, you just articulated that very well, and I'm gonna just simplify it a little bit. Um, so it's almost like just viewing the capitalist critique as a trope, essentially, and that actually just because you don't have competition for wages doesn't mean you're getting rid of competition, right? If you still have different workers co-ops doing different businesses, they're naturally going to be competing for business and the such, like the wage labor aside. Because I do agree in just in the theory of competition, I guess, in the sense that it does drive ingenuity. um so I really like what you said about well, the whole self-determination thing, but the internal motivation, and when someone's not just working for a wage, they're actually like just striving to build and create and find better modes of production in their own right, like their natural way of doing so. Because I think we as humans actually like to work. It's just the like sort of wage theft and whatnot going on that actually makes us hate work because again, like you said, we feel like we're working for that holiday or for that raise, or rather than actually just working for the work itself.
Yeah, 100%. Like, uh, I would even go so far as that, like, you do actually see examples of people who are more or less getting exploited or not getting the best they could out of like their actual wages, still wanting to come to work and still working really, really hard because the company manages to nail that intrinsic motivation.
Mm.
Now, whether that's exploitation or not is a whole other discussion, of course. But the worker themselves, at least intersubjectively, says, I value what I'm doing here, even perhaps more over and above the wage that I'm getting, even though I still need the wage because we all do. Um,
Yeah. But so basically I guess the answer to the critique is that like one, you're not eliminating competition, and two, because of the self-determination theory, you're actually going to create more ingenuity than what the capitalist system is doing now.
Yeah,
Cool.
and
All
you
right.
also have to ask the question of like the different types of competition as well, because not all competition is good competition. I feel like a lot of conversations with capitalists tend to abstract that a bit. We just have this like big umbrella term competition, and we assume that's the same thing in all cases. But you've got competition, like for example, price gouging. Where big companies try to undercut smaller companies and drive smaller businesses away from the market. Um, but then you've also got people like out trying to outcompete each other to make the best product. Both of those are competition, but one is certainly more valuable than the other. And what we tend to find in workers' cooperatives, it strikes the best aspects of competition with the best aspects of cooperation, which often also gets neglected sometimes. Because as much as we need to compete as a species to do better, we also more so need to cooperate, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think too that another bad version of competition in a system like what we have, at least in the U.S. I don't know how your guys is exactly or wherever you're from. I didn't even ask. Um, but I guess another bad version is sometimes it becomes competition to produce the most. And so then actually the quality of the item that's being produced goes way down because what you're prioritizing is the mass production rather than the actual thing itself.
Yeah, 100%.
Oh,
I'm from Australia, by the way.
okay. Yeah, cool. Um, all right. Man, it's like I'd like to go down this more, but I'm having problems disagreeing with you. So, and I don't
It's a
want
good
to wear
problem to
my
have, I guess.
capitalist hat all night. Um, I guess why do you go so far as to be an anarchist rather than like socialist, Marxist, communist, or something like that?
It ultimately always, for me as an anarchist, comes down to the right to freedom of association and the fact that I, from the way that I see it, it's impossible to have that right while anybody has the monopoly over violence or the
Mm,
monopoly over the means of production. And so some people might reply to that and say, well, yeah, that's true, but maybe we just can't have the right to freedom of association in a practical sense, right? Maybe it's just impossible. And my other attitude towards that is that a lot of the times, the problems we tend to solve or try to solve with the monopoly on violence and with all these different things that are associated with governments and with big business, they don't actually go away, right? Like if you just look at like the rate at which police tend to solve crimes, like actually solve crimes. I think I saw this was in America. This might be outdated, but I remember seeing something like it was less than 40%, like less than 40% of like I think it was robberies end up getting solved, and it's probably even lower than that, honestly. So that's less than a coin flip, you know. I feel like even if you now this isn't in a system I advocated for, but even if you had the parody version of anarchism where everyone's running around burning things down purely by chance, you'd end up with more justice than in the system we
mm.
currently have. I reckon, like especially like with the famous issue of targeting minorities and their corruption and everything like that. So it's like if you're going to have all this crime anyway that they're not solving, that they're not bringing to justice, and on top of that you have all this corruption and an inability to do anything about it yourself. It's like honestly, like every society eventually has to ask that question: at what point would I be better off just in the woods? You know,
Mm.
like at what point is society so bad and that run down that I would just be better off? Like the whole point of society is supposed to be a better alternative to that, right? And so if it's not, then it's like, then what's the point of the institution?
Okay, so I'm wondering if you can ultimately avoid any type of monopoly on violence. I think this is maybe a good place where we could try to flesh out some disagreements because um I think naturally humans coagulate, form communities together. Um, and so I'm sort of envisioning I I don't want to say like, you know, the fall of society because that looks sort of post-apocalyptic, but just a society where there is not this power structure or whatever, this big governing body. Um, and it almost seems like a libertarian in a sense where I can just picture like people owning plots of land with communities, compounds, whatever it may be, and they're just sort of running their own show, right? um I don't know where that might fit into your vision or not, but it seems that no matter what, you're going to get pockets of people who group together because we do better together. That's just how humans operate. And even in those little groups, you're going to have monopolies on power to a degree, and you're going to have some type of violent or enforcing of violence in a way because you might constantly be at threat of running into another group who lives across the river or I mean hopefully you could make peace with them, but looking at human history that's usually not the case. um so you're going to have to at least be able to have violence in the capacity to defend yourself, and then someone's going to own that monopoly in that compound. to a degree, and maybe just the democratic force at that point would be able to overthrow it because it's not so big. Um, but yeah, I guess that's maybe a problem I'm seeing with it.
Yeah, when it comes to things like violence and self-defense, I can't make too many like I can't paint too much of a picture as much as I'd like to, simply because I don't know what shape self-defense is going to take within the next 10, 50, 100 years, right? Like if you imagine a cyberpunk like scenario where people have like robotic limbs or something like that, what does self-defense look like in that kind of world? And maybe will there be technologies that change the whole game that we haven't even thought of yet?
Yeah,
If there's some
sorry
sort of
if sorry for interrupting, but I so the self-defense piece of that is just to say that like this little community over here has to have a practice of violence in order to self-defend, right? Like because if their compound gets attacked, right? Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward. But so if this community has the capability to self-defend, they also have the capability to monopolize force within their own community. Say like I'm like the head honcho in this community, I sort of have the monopoly on violence. If I'm like the strongest one, I have the biggest gun, whatever. Um, so they could just within that little compound be the monopoly on violence, and instead of like big government doing it to the whole society, it's now just pockets of like mob bosses or whatever enforcing power on their little compounds.
well, the best way to defend against that, I would say, is like having like all these little sort of pockets, right? As you mentioned, would have to be sort of interdependent on one another. So like they're not
Mhm.
like isolated little communes. They're not isolated like where everyone's completely off and doing their own thing. There would have to be some sort of like interconnectivity and interdependence such that like each commune, for example, still has their independent identity. But if like the universal right to freedom of association is being violated for any one member in the group, an outside member sort of comes in um, out of a sense of obligation. Again, it would come down to like, an understanding that a kind of this idea that a threat to injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere kind of thing. As well as if, like in an economic sense, if all the communes are interdependent on one another, there's more of an incentive to care about what's going on maybe across the pond. Um, and so you would have, I guess, anarchist communities who are sort of checking in, maybe doing even an audit on other communities to make sure everything's above board, nobody's getting hurt or anything. I think the key comes down to just a lot of interconnectivity.
Yeah. Um and I don't think this has to be a negative. Confederacy has become a negative word in the US, but I don't think it has to be. But that's kind of what you're describing, right? And like Confederacy existed before the Brits ever came to the Americas, right? Or anyone else came. Like Native Americans were practicing types of confederacies with different tribes who sort of do what you are explaining, right? They're all their own independent tribes, but they realized the interconnectedness, and did just that. So it does sound a lot like a confederacy. Uh, you're just you're weeding out the feds, I guess. That's what you'd be doing in a way.
It is kind of like that. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about the ins and outs of like everything to do with Confederacy. Like I know, for example, like there is an ugly history with it in the US because of the Civil War and everything like that. And the association that sort of brings to mind of like, Johnny Reb and everything like that. Um, but I think, yeah, usually we tend to we just take the con part. We just call it a federation of some kind usually.
Yeah.
That's just terminology
Well,
usually.
I think that the US is a good example of why confederacies can, or everything has its flaw, right? So I guess why people argued that we did need a federal system, because you get X groups of states saying no, it's okay to have slaves, and you get X groups of slaves saying, well, no, it's not. um that's very broad painted brush of the actual history of it all, right? But Just say hypothetically, if that's as basic as it was, there's a problem there because now we have all these interdependent tribes and some are interconnected in one way, or tribes, communes, whatever. The other half are interconnected in their thought, and from there you get the civil war type stuff. And this would be the good argument, I guess, for authoritarianism or a federal system. It doesn't have to be like a dictator, but some type of overarching power on violence, power on the law, the legislation a bit, to sort of keep the interconnectedness stable. Other Yeah, sorry, respond to that before I go off on another tangent.
Yeah, so this is where a certain principle of like historical materialism, or just understanding that the material conditions need to be right for anarchism to take place. And basically, when it comes to influencing behavior, you really have two tools. One is classic force and violence, and the other is reason or information, knowledge, that sort of thing. If you can inform that what somebody's doing is wrong, and you can convince them based on the idea that it is wrong, I guess, then that's obviously always a preferred alternative to just good old-fashioned violence. Now, that's not always possible. Some people can be ignorant or arrogant or whatever it is, and the force of reason doesn't always work as well as the sword, unfortunately. However, what would need to be in place in order for an anarchist society to function, especially if it's a highly democratic one, would be a significant increase in the dissemination of reasonable, um, uh, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, I guess high quality education. Um,
Mm.
and the way that I guess we would do this, so like the answer, I guess, just before I go into like the full prescription of how I would set this up, is just that in an anarchist society, we would want everyone to be as educated as possible about just everything, really, such that you know you don't have people like being pro-slavery, I guess, if that makes sense.
Mm. Okay. Oh, well, this could sort of be our transition into, I guess, Christianity a little bit then, because, right, you have, again, every description I'm making is reflective of the US, so I don't really know how your system is, but here, we have like pretty large groups of Christians who actually think that the academy is Satanist. They actually are lying and not giving education. They're turning us from God with all this science bogus. Um, so I see that as a slight hiccup, I guess. And I guess you were, yeah, I guess you were just saying it would have to be the case that humans agreed that education is a worthy pursuit. So whether that's actually possible or not is maybe a different question.
Yeah, I would say that there seems to be an anomaly with American Christianity, not in the sense that you don't see similar trends everywhere else, because what tends to happen in America, for example, tends to happen here as well. Like, we tend to follow suit. There's a bit of lag, I guess, but we're very culturally connected.
Mm.
So we have conversations over here about Trump more often than we do our own politicians, for example. And I imagine that's very common pretty much
Uh,
everywhere.
I was gonna say, I wonder how common that thread is, but
Yeah, and I guess throughout most of Christian history, education was a very, especially if you go back into Jewish history, that still is today. Like, the Jewish standard of education, like, was uh, like well above and beyond uh, a lot of contemporaries for their time. That's not to say that everyone was as educated as they should be. There was still lots of illiterate people, but um, you know, you connected through God to God through the scriptures, so there was a big incentive to read. That was one thing, for example, in those societies. And so this kind of anti-intellectualism we see in American um, uh, versions of Christianity, that very much came about due to certain historical factors that have to do. It gets into a lot of religious history of like old light versus new light movement, and there's like a whole backstory I could get into. Um, but I guess my response to that is that even in some of Christianity's worst times, there weren't. Christianity wasn't anti-intellectual as such. Not even far from it. Like even back during the times of like the Catholics running everything, there was still this kind of sense of scholarly pursuit. Like if you look at the writings of the early Christians, an overwhelming
Hmm.
majority of them were arguing on the grounds of the philosophy of their time. A lot of them were Platonists, Aristotelians, and Stoics, and all that sort of stuff. And so we Christians have a rich history of being scholars, being the ones who drive scholarship, and not being anti-intellectual. In fact, it's often the case that like what a lot of American Christians are doing now, like on that conservative side, is this very much this kind of I'm right, you're wrong, being very wise in your own eyes, being very anti sort of not very curious, and going by intuition. Those are the three things that not only does the Bible say is bad, but throughout a lot of Christian history, the way we used to do things, um, we were the ones who were always against intuition. Again, because let's be honest, a lot of what we teach is very unintuitive. You've got God Himself dying on a cross. You've got the Trinity. You've got a lot of different things that go well against a lot of people's intuitions. So we used to be very much against that kind of intuitive kind of approach to things. But you see that kind of flip in American culture. And I remember I was also reading this book. I haven't read a heap of it, but there was a book by a guy named Hofstadter or something like that. It was back in the 60s where he identified three different points of um, anti-intellectualism within American culture. One of them was like religious anti-rationalism, but another was like a reflexive, um, what was it? An unreflective instrumentalism. That has
Mm,
also, I do notice that a lot with American sort of thinkers, not necessarily in the sense that they're all anti-intellectual, but Americans love their pragmatism. When it comes to like
yeah.
philosophy and that sort of stuff, they don't really care about a lot of metaphysics or high-minded stuff if they can't use it for anything. It's like, okay, Plato, there's a world of forms. How's that going to
Yeah.
help me make money at my business? Whereas we Christians, we are, well, again, historically, I'm sort of appealing to like a history a bit, our sense of pragmatism has been non-existent. We've never been pragmatic. Some of the ideas that we've come up with are some of the least pragmatic ideas in philosophy. Some of it's extremely fascinating, but like a lot of the ideas that we've thought of would ordinarily, not always, but ordinarily would make no difference to you, an ordinary person's practical everyday sort of living, in like an earthly sense. Um, so yeah, I just
Yeah.
noticed that there's a lot of trends that like it feels like America's changed a lot of Christianity in America rather than America changing a lot of Christianity.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
No.
Christianity changed a
Oh,
lot of America. You know what I mean? Yeah.
you made a lot of good points. So uh I want to respond to a few. So um first of all, yeah, I think I never thought about this, but I think you're right about sort of the American intellectualism a bit, in the sense that, and I think this exists on both sides of the aisle, or both. I don't even think there's both sides. That's just an easy way to, a pragmatic way to refer to it, because I'm an American. Look at me go. um, but like on the more progressive side of things, right? We even have it. It's called postmodernism, right? We don't really care why it's justified for the things we're pursuing or whatever. It's not me. I'm just saying we, because I generally fall into that category. But yeah, postmoderns don't care at all about the justification of why. It's just like, well, because it's sort of a feeling thing, but also reasoned around this freedom and autonomy thing, right? And which I'm all on board. Like that's one of my biggest principles, is the autonomy, consent, freedom to self dictate. Um, but maybe there's a slight overcorrection in just saying this is the only important thing. Metaphysics, God, none of this matters, because everyone can have their own truth if we just let them be autonomous. Maybe it serves to feed this type of anti-intellectualism and lazy thinking. Maybe like it's just not enough competitive good dialogue and debate and reasoning about these things, because we're just, well, that's your truth and this is mine. And it's a good point with like the right wing Christians and whatnot too. Is like, um, not in the sense that they're postmodern, but they have this like lazy reasoning. It's just, well, God's real. This is what my pastor taught me, and there's not that sort of reflective or that like engaging in dialectic aspect. Um, so I thought that was a really good
Yeah.
point. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but just to add to your point there, you also even on the conservative side have those cultural Christians, right? Where it's like they don't necessarily know if they believe in the actual metaphysical commitments of Christianity, but they like the pragmatic aspects or the moral aspects, or it's the bedrock of Western civilization, that kind of thing. You know, like Jordan
Mhm.
Peterson, for example. And yeah, that's I would also see that as a kind of I don't know if it's unreflective instrumentalism or something, but it kind of does uh, fall into that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's as anti-intellectual. If they're reasoning about the metaphysics still and just concluding that, because I just think that where the problem is, it is the lack of reflectiveness and the lack of reasoning. So while I dislike Jordan Peterson, I do think he actually does try to reason through his positions a lot. Um, I don't know. Maybe you could say he's just trying to weasel out of every question he gets because he doesn't actually give a clear answer. But
Yeah,
yeah, and I mean, obviously, you can bring up Griff stuff too and whatnot. So maybe we just shouldn't get into Jordan Peterson. But um,
yeah, that's
I do think there's a difference though in like intellectual leaders, even if they are doing the instrumentalism thing that you're talking about, versus just the general population who went to high school and now they're Christian and they're getting emotional about Trump because he's like the savior of the new world or whatever, right? That's to me that's a systematic education problem or a media problem, like a propaganda problem, I guess. Um, but yeah, just briefly with the Christian academia, like I agree with you 100%. Like the history of universities in general came out of Christian thought. It started in just like theological schools, and then science started coming about. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like Christians have always been doing the rational theology and whatnot. So I'm gonna have to chew on that a bit. Last thing on this is where does the Bible say that intuition is bad? Because that's not ringing a bell for me, and I would like to see that verse.
it doesn't
Or
say intuition specifically, but it says that the heart is deceitful above all things, right? Like making
mm,
decisions with the heart, going by the heart, you know, relying on your own understanding of what makes sense to you. There's plenty in the Proverbs, in the whole book of Proverbs, that talks about this. And yeah, there's that famous verse in Jeremiah: "The heart is deceitful above all things; it's unbelievably sick. Who can help it?" Sort of thing. Um, and yeah, like there's even a recurring theme in Christianity: the idea that your heart is hardened. And that's kind of this idea that you kind of become intellectually sort of stubborn against an idea and you just sort of resist it. Um, yeah,
so
there's a lot in there.
what about, and this is just one verse, but and keep in mind I was raised Mormon, so sort of maybe some of these
Same.
stories. Oh, really? Oh,
Well, kind of. I wasn't raised Mormon, but my mother was an on again, off again member of the LDS community.
oh,
They're
okay.
weirdly popular in Australia. Like, there's a lot of, especially in for
Interesting.
Samoans as well. They're
They're
very
actually popular all over because they send missionaries out like it's God's business. Like they have the missionary thing down.
yeah,
So but
yeah,
anyway, the still small voice thing was huge in my church, and like what that, and it's out of first, or at least one of the verses, First Kings 19:12, um talking about, sorry, I didn't actually pull the verse up. um but I guess Elijah got visited by some still small voice, and it supposedly gave him like the courage and strength he needed. I don't really know the story or context, but um, all I know is that the still small voice was a massive part of the LDS faith, at least, and it did refer to this sort of like supernatural relation that you have with God. And that if you're praying, if you're doing all these things, you'll sort of be guided in kind of an intuitive way to make the right decisions and whatnot. So again, if it's just an LDS thing, I guess what would you make of this verse?
Well, the still small voice would usually be referring to the Holy Spirit, and while we can often conflate, especially with how we talk about it, the Holy Spirit versus intuitions, it's very important to keep those two things separate because if it's intuitions, that's just your own brain talking, right? The Holy Spirit is usually something that gives you revelation that usually is very unintuitive. Like it's supposed to um, deliver you things that you wouldn't already know, I guess. And while
Mm.
a lot of people could certainly have a lot of experiential feelings with it and tied up with it, um, it's not so much a feeling based thing. I think even in the LDS church, you get like small promptings versus big revelations. It's like a whole different thing because I know that LDS is very big on the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And you're right. The still small voice does refer for the LDS people as well to the Holy Spirit. But and I might be conflating the burning in the bosom thing with the still small voice. Because that is also another big thing that you were taught that like when you're praying, if you get that like sort of emotional connection, kind of like a burning love type thing, then you know that you're like either the spirits with you or whatever it may be. Um, so I think this is a good place to explore actually because I don't know how, at least for me, you would always be able to decipher the two. I know you mentioned that it's normally prompts about things that um you wouldn't actually find normal, right? So if it's just your everyday like intuition but I feel like intuition does that as well. Like there's times when I get this vibe or whatever that something's not right. Um and half the time I follow up or check on it, yeah, my intuition was true, and half the time it wasn't. Um like if it's just about bad, like these people don't feel right, like I don't want to be around them anymore, but I have no rational basis for that, no like actual reasoning because they seem completely normal. um how how would one decipher that to be the still small voice?
well, when you get those intuitions, right, and those gut sort of gut feelings, right, what are the feelings that are associated with that for you?
um that when it's with, yeah, it's sort of this kind of like heavy gut feeling, I guess. It's hard to describe. I've never actually tried to like describe a feeling like that, but yeah, I guess heavy gut, not good, I guess is a good way to put it.
Well, I guess that for the Holy Spirit, it's like again, I'm not LDS, so I don't know how, I'm not speaking for how they would pass this out.
Right, right.
But usually, the two ways you would test this, you wouldn't so much necessarily test it by the way it feels, but I guess there is a difference in feeling, I would suppose, and uh, it's more about like because it says in the Bible to test all things by the Spirit, and basically, does the Spirit confess Jesus as Lord, right? That and so it's like it's kind of like the fruits of what comes out of you following that prompting or intuition or whatever it is, right? If the spiritual thing that you're feeling is bringing you closer to Christ, then it's probably the Holy Spirit, again, according to Christian theology. And if it's bringing you further away, then it's probably not. It depends on sort of what's coming out of that and what has historically come out of that when you've had similar experiences, right? So if it's told you to do things in the past that would ordinarily go against Christianity, it's probably, you might want to be careful about that. Or
Hmm.
if it's in the past, it's brought you closer to Christ, then it's, probably legit.
Okay, so the still small voice should always be related, I guess, to Christ in some way, whereas like maybe mundane actions that neither take me further from Christ or draw me closer could just be seen as intuition because it's not really connected to God in this type of way. It's just me using my intuition, I guess.
Yeah, I'd probably say it's probably about
Okay.
right. Yeah, like it's not to say that I wouldn't say intuition is like universally bad or trustworthy, right? To me, intuition is just sort of the collection of instincts based on either experiences and maybe genetics, but I don't know how much that gets into it. Um, but like, if for example you've constantly had a recurring experience of like I don't know, every time you see I don't know a certain person, they usually are associated with a negative feeling. Um, Somebody else who looks vaguely like them or has a similar sort of vibe might trigger that same sort of negative feeling. I mean, it's kind of that sort of almost
Mm-hmm.
Humean constant conjunction kind of thing going on. And so there's situations where it can be reliable because it has a survivalistic reason for being in there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but obviously, operating on your intuitions and instincts is kind of at a lower, baser level thing. It's how I'm not saying it's animalistic to trust it,
Well,
instincts
and
because they're there
they're
for a reason, but it's what animals.
yeah.
Oh, so sorry, you go. Sorry.
Sorry, we're also slightly delayed too. So
Yeah, yeah.
sometimes, um, well, I was just gonna say there's also like mirror neurons, right? So like there is sort of even just a natural implicate like a natural res- empathetic way to be without you even actually like cognizantly trying to be empathetic. You can start to feel bad or good just based on your observations of other people feeling that way unconsciously. Um, I wanted to ask because I feel like if you're someone who believes in a soul, um, how could you rule out people connecting their soul substances in a way? So like, and I'm not saying it has to be like some psychic type thing where you're just reading someone's thoughts, but like maybe if we all have this sort of soul substance that I would assume is made out of the same type of substance, um, could you rule out actually that when we're intuitively feeling some way about some other people, that we're just actually sort of connecting our soul substance in a way? And so I'm like sharing that experience a little bit.
Well, that's an interesting one. I guess my view of the soul is that it wouldn't so much be something. Hmm, I don't know. I guess that's getting into a very metaphysical question, but I would say that the soul would just be kind of like for me, it's like a repository of like an immaterial repository of um qualia that you've experienced, and it maybe contains your memories in some way. Because like one of my biggest reasons for believing in a soul is um something called terminal lucidity. Have you heard of terminal lucidity?
I I don't think so.
Well, terminal lucidity is this phenomenon that we've observed where you have like say old people who have like dementia, for example, or any brain condition that physically alters the structure of the brain, such that maybe they experience memory loss or impaired behaviors or whatever it is. Terminal lucidity is what happens where they all of a sudden get better for no discernible reason, and then moments later they die. So, for example, let's say you got somebody with dementia who doesn't remember their daughter's name. Whatever part of their brain that stored that memory is gone. But then just before they die, they just say their daughter's name and they remember it and they're able to have a completely lucid conversation where maybe they might have even been nonverbal before. And then they just sort of die.
Hmm.
Now, to me, that would seem to suggest that because the physical structure of the brain is about it's dying, so it seems to be about to deteriorate even further. It doesn't seem that you would see any improvement, like because the physical structure of the brain seems to still be damaged, and yet you still have the presence of that memory. There might be a sort of immaterial aspect of it. Um, so I think that the soul might help you be able to call memories into being, I guess. So, but nothing. I don't know if it'd be able to create anything new. So I guess this would be my one test. if you're experiencing the Holy Spirit and it's telling you something, is that thing it's telling you in line with what you already believe and in line with what you already know? Or is it giving you unintuitive or strange information that doesn't even really even seem right to you, but you still are receiving that impression, right? So, like for example, if you get a message from the Holy Spirit saying like, "Oh, it's going to rain tomorrow," this is just an example. It's going to rain tomorrow, and you think to yourself, "That doesn't seem right. It seems pretty cloudy. It seems pretty sunny today. It doesn't really, the news anchor says it's going to be sunny tomorrow. It doesn't seem like it. That doesn't make any sense." Um, if it then ends up raining tomorrow, and you got that message completely against anything that you would have otherwise had thought, um, then that would be a way of discerning it. So it's kind of like, yeah, is it in line with the thoughts that are already in your head, or is it something new? It has to be something novel, I guess, would be a good way to put it.
Hmm. Okay. Uh, I I really want to actually talk about the soul now, but I'm wondering if maybe we could sort of chew on this, both of us, and at some point talk to each other again. Just because I'm interested in like what you think the soul substance is, and when I say substance, it doesn't necessarily have to be a material one, right? And obviously, if it's immaterial, I'm not expecting that you like have descriptors for it or like. Mostly, what I'm interested in is like how it how it could interact, first of all, with material things, and second of all, like with other souls after death, with Jesus, with God. If, presumably you want to go to heaven as your soul. um just because to me it seems like if it's all made from the same substance, even if it's an immaterial one, there would be this shared like connectedness to that one substance. And it's sort of, you've probably heard of like egg theory type stuff, where there's just this like one soul thing that gets dispersed into different humans, so really we're all the same soul, we're all the God thing. So yeah, anyway, we don't have to get too into it, but maybe we could talk about it at a later date. um I wanted to hear what you thought about this, because I've lately been thinking that like, so if God is true, is real, if Christianity is true, if Jesus was God, all of these things, then to me, like if I were to believe this, say, I genuinely think I would view the church institutions that are powerful and sort of running the show and everything are actually the influence of Satan. Um, and this kind of goes back into the academia thing again, right? Because they're sort of just leading their followers just to be followed, just to have the following, maybe the money, whatever it may be. Um, and so there's this, and it goes back to the autonomy stuff again, the freedom of people to live as sinners, even if, if they want to, rather than make laws about gay people or whatever, right? So to me, it just seems like most church institutions in general are actually the work of Satan, and I'm just curious what you thought of that.
I don't know if the institutions themselves are the work of Satan, but I do think there's plenty of corruption by Satan, or whatever evils that you want to. I guess there was a sort of degradation of the quality of a lot of what these institutions should be, what they promise to be, and what they actually deliver. For example, I'm very critical of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. They claim to be like the exclusive authority and the exclusive thing that they're the exclusive access to Christ kind of thing. Um, I'm very critical of that, but I'm also very critical of a lot of Protestant um, denominations. I guess this is why I'm non-denominational, right? Um, I guess I would see it that there is actually something. The Bible actually talks about this quite a bit, in that not only does it say that this is going to happen, it says that there will be a falling away, and that the love of most will grow cold. But there's also a parable, um, uh, a parable of the wheat and the tares. It's called, and basically the gist of it is that there's this farmer. He sows a bunch of wheat, and then his enemy comes in and sows a bunch of like weeds next to the wheat to basically ruin all the wheat. And the idea is that, well, we're going to let both the wheat and the weeds grow up together, and at the end of the age, we'll harvest the wheat and put it all in the good place, and take all the weeds and put them in the bad place. But the key thing to remember about this parable is that the weeds are right next to the wheat, which means there's no corner of the crop which you can point to and say that that's all clean. We know that that's all safe. There's no like
Mm.
outwardly discernible. Well, it is outwardly discernible in the sense that it's about outward behavior. You know, it's like the fruit that you bear, but it's not like you can tell before that fruit has been made manifest. And so it's like you're going to have individuals that are really good Christians, or maybe they're still struggling, but they're still honest Christians and they're saved. And you're going to have them standing right next to the devil himself. And
Mm.
they're all going to be one part of the institution. So even though I'm very critical of the Catholic Church, for example, I don't think all Catholics are damned. I think there are a lot of earnest, lovely people that just want to connect to Christ, and it's a very earnest thing. Even though I think that the Catholic Church has done a lot of really horrible things, so um, I guess it's good to be very distrustful of institutions because they get corrupted very, very easily. The Bible is just a repeated story over and over and over again of institutions getting corrupted over and over again.
Mm.
And the primary archetypical example of that is the Pharisees, which were a conservative religious sect, which were the ones that put Jesus to death, right? And so it's that kind of religious orthodoxy and religious conservatism, not in the sense that, well, they took the Bible too seriously and that's why they're corrupt. No, no, no. It's uh, this kind of heart hardening. I would actually chalk it up to a kind of anti-intellectualism and a kind of lack of curiosity. It's this kind of idea of being so confident in what you think you know. Like if you ask a lot of conservative Christians what they think they know about the fundamentals, they're going to be rock solid and really confident on some very basic things. They're going to tell you with absolute certainty that, yep, being gay is definitely a sin and there's no discussion to be had about it. Or that, where, we're saved by faith apart from works, or the Catholics will say we're saved by faith and works, and they're extremely confident on what they think they know. But it's because of that overconfidence that leads them to a kind of hardened heart, and it leads to a lack of curiosity where God, when God Himself literally shows up, they don't listen to Him. And so that's what I think is the core root of all that.
So, all right, I'm really interested in this, but I think we need to kind of hash out a couple things. So, because I mentioned like Satan influencing institutions or whatever, right? And you seemed maybe a little hesitant to. I guess I should just ask, like, what theologically speaking, what is the devil to you? Who is Satan? Can he actually directly influence people, or does yeah? Just brief rundown on who Satan is and how he works.
Well, I think that Satan is like a well, Satan is first of all, it's tricky because the word Satan gets used multiple different ways in the Bible. First and foremost, it's a category which means enemy. So it's
Mm.
like it's derived from like an ancient Hebrew word that just means enemy, the enemy, and the enemy can refer to multiple different beings, right? Spiritual beings or otherwise. But then of course there's the capital S Satan, the guy, the Antichrist kind of guy. And yes, I do believe that he's a literal conscious entity and can influence things.
Mm.
But what number one, he's limited by God. Like God, there's a certain limit to what he can do. And number two, there's a lot of what we Satan can only influence you ideologically, in my view. And yes, there is a certain sense in which maybe in certain situations he can gain power to harm people and actually do things which affect things physically. But throughout different periods of time, and this is going to come down to your view of Revelations and everything like that, like the Book of Revelations. I believe that his ability to do things physically is limited until he physically shows up.
Mm.
And until that point, it's mostly just people, human beings, being as flawed as they always have been, being influenced by his ideas, but not so much by like their demonic possession. So, like, here's an example. I'm very anti-Trump. I think Trump has been a horrible influence, not just on American politics, but on Christianity especially. He's done a lot of really bad harm. That being said, I don't know if he's literal. I don't think he is the Antichrist. He might be in cahoots with him, but I don't think Trump is like some sort of like he's literally being puppeted, or like his soul is possessed by demons necessarily. Maybe I wouldn't put it past him, but I don't think he would have to be in order to do the harm that he is doing. I think human
Yeah.
beings do an overwhelming amount of the harm, basically.
Okay. I think I maybe see the hiccup in the communication here because you said that Satan can influence people ideologically basically, but essentially it's always the humans doing the corrupt thing, the bad thing. It's not like Satan has just this hierarchy of like mob bosses who like have a monopoly on force or whatever. It's just the ideological influence and the, I guess, the sin probably, and the corrupting nature itself, which is what I was sort of referring to when I said that Satan has an influence on the institutions, in the sense that, um power, greed is a sin, right? Like greed itself is a sin. So yeah, sorry, I sort of lost what I was thinking there,
Yeah.
but basically, yeah, I was just saying that if I believed in Jesus, I would view these institutions as being corrupted by Satan, and not necessarily that he's like sitting on the throne and like calling the shots. The humans are still calling the shots, but they are captured by Satan because of their corruption.
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of that going on, a fair amount. Yeah,
And in fact, have you ever looked into Gnosticism at all?
I have. I'm very critical of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I because it tends to be like a lot of Platonists and philosophy bros trying to um, Platonize Christianity, and I think that's ironically a lot of what the Catholic Church ends up doing.
Hmm.
Um, but like one of the key things is that also Gnosticism is very occult in the sense that occult is a word that usually means like hidden, so it has to do with hidden knowledge, secret knowledge, that hidden
Mm-hmm.
gnosis. And one of the core teachings of Jesus is that if you have light, be a light to the world and share it with people. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. If you have, nobody puts a lamp under a bushel, right? So if you have knowledge that is supposed to be good for people, share it. Be open. Like we Christians, literally, were willing to face crucifixion just to preach about Jesus. So the idea of this idea of secret knowledge, I'm very. It
Well,
feels very
the secret knowledge bit, uh yeah, I want to convince you that it fits. So um it's sort of like mysticism, right? Where it's just that this knowledge is only accessible by direct connection to the logos, to Christ, to the divine. That's like the only way to actually know it and acquire it. But I think it still can fit into those teachings of Christ saying to be the light of the world, right? Because you still, if you have that connection, if you have that gnosis, you still are going to exemplify it and sort of try to lead people to it, even though they have to do it themselves. You're still going to try. It's sort of like, I don't know how much you've looked into Buddhism, but it's sort of the same concept where like someone can only become enlightened by themselves doing the thing and being enlightened. There's no actual way to communicate how to get enlightened, yet Buddhas still have thousands years of histories of attempting to communicate it, even though they literally say over and over, you cannot communicate this. It's beyond words. So they're still trying to be the light of the words, of the world, still trying to guide people to that enlightenment, even though just the knowledge itself has to come through that direct connection.
well, I would 100% agree that you can't really know God without some sort of direct connection, right? Like that's why like I'm very critical of a lot of people who try to solve God like times tables in your head, right? In the sense of trying to like using pure logic, right? Because you can't use pure logic to know what a raspberry tastes like, right? For example, and there's a lot you can't use pure logic to know events that have happened in history, right? The fact that Julius Caesar was who he was or whatever isn't something you can learn by applying the law of non-contradiction in sort of like a syllogism or something. And I think God's a bit like that in the sense that there's some things you can know about him through pure logic, but there's always going to be that limit, and you do have to directly experience God. The problem with Gnosticism is that it does try to do this pure logic thing a little bit. It tries to engage with this kind of light of reason thing. And I'm by no means against reason. We just had a whole conversation about how anti-intellectualism is a real problem. It's that they try to syllogize, if that's even a right way to put it. They try to a lot of the times. This is not with all Gnostic groups, because Gnostic's a bit
Hmm.
of a blanket term. The
Right.
Gnostics that I'm most familiar with are the very Platonic ones, right?
Mm,
The ones
okay.
who are very much like what tends to happen with Gnosticism is the reason that they don't think Jesus came in like the actual flesh is because it doesn't gel well with Platonic philosophy, which says that
Oh,
the
okay.
the material body is inherently evil and inherently disgusting and inherently gross. Like if you think that Christians are very anti-sex, you've got nothing on the Gnostics, right? These Gnostics hated the concept of the human body. Okay, like we at least think that we'll have resurrected bodies, for example. Um, and
Yeah.
that sex isn't like this inherently evil thing. But yeah, so the Gnostics, they tend to be a bit too platonic for my taste, I guess I'd say.
Well, and I'm glad you said it because it is definitely a blanket term, and I think even some of my knowledge about Gnosticism isn't quite lining up with some of the things. Like, I didn't really know that it was very Platonic at all. Like, I think that maybe what I've learned about it so far is more the mysticism side. Um, and I guess I'll share because it relates back to the Satan influencing the institution thing as well. This is what I really like about at least the Gnostic stories that I've engaged with and learned about. Um, Essentially, what it's saying is that there is this divine, there's this logos, right? All of this God, whatever we call it. Somewhere along the line, there was an evil, they call it the demiurge, right? And this demiurge is what created materiality, everything material, because this demiurge wanted to be worshipped and wanted his own world, all of this stuff. And that's why they're viewing material as like evil, right? Because it came from the evil entity. But it's cool because at least for me, in the story of like the Garden of Eden, right? Jesus is not God. Jesus is the serpent because Adam and Eve are being sort of held captive in this perfect garden world of material, um, where they're worshiping God and following his rules and everything, right? The serpent comes along and says, "Hey, there's this fruit here. If you take it, you will be able to gain knowledge. You'll be able to actually gain more knowledge about good and evil, right? There's like more beyond this material cage that you're stuck in." So that's who Jesus was supposed to be for this Gnostic story. And by the way, this version of Gnosticism does think that the Logos was reincarnated into Jesus as well. So they do view Jesus as God in the flesh. And because he came like the serpent, he also came as a man to remind us that he is the light, he is the true way to the like divine source, basically.
Yeah, well, my view of Genesis is very different in the sense that like because the way that I view God is I view God as like the ultimate living embodiment of freedom, right? The most absolute free being that could possibly exist. And that when God was creating people, the goal is to get these people, to get humans to be in the presence of God, such that humans are as free as they can be, as maximally free as we can be, and that our freedom has the fewest limitations physically possible. Unfortunately, that entails things like control over like universal constants, that kind of freedom. Unfortunately, in order to learn how to have that freedom and how to use it ethically, you kind of have to not already have it, and it's sort of like you have to have these limitations on your will and to learn to like sort of overcome them step by step in order to actually get there properly. I'm simplifying a lot of it, but that's the essence of it. And so when Satan shows up in the garden as the serpent, right? He's very crafty in the sense that like everything that he uses to tempt Adam and Eve are all pure motivations. They're actually he uses good things to tempt, like the things that we should want, in order to sway them. Like a lot of people misunderstand. Everyone I've ever spoken to has misread Genesis in the part where he says, there's one part in the story where he says, "Did God actually say you're not allowed to eat the fruit of the tree?" And it's funny, God actually, not only does Satan know this, but God never actually said that. And Eve is the one who points this out to him. He says, no, 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 God didn't say that. God said we can eat any fruit from any tree we want as long as it's not that fruit in that tree in the midst of the garden. And it's like Satan basically asked that rhetorical questions to sort of lure them into this kind of conversation where it's like, you will not surely die, but you will become like God, knowing good and evil. And that's a good thing. Knowing good and evil is a good thing. Like the idea is that they did know good and evil, I believe, before they ate the fruit. It's just they didn't know it perfectly. It would essentially be omniscience. That was what was entailed with eating this fruit. However, the problem with omniscience is that there's kind of a there's an increase in freedom and a decrease in freedom entailed in gaining knowledge. Um, and anybody who understands the principle of an information hazard knows exactly why that is. Because not everything that you could know is necessarily a good. I mean, I do believe that we should be able to know as much as possible, and we should be able to explore and confront information. It's just that there's a correct way to go about it, and there's sort of a sense in which our will has to be made amenable to the thing that we learn. Because even if we learn something, that doesn't mean our will is I guess amenable to it. Like we can learn that punching people in the head is wrong and still do it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, and so I believe that basically I think that it was sort of like God wanted to take them there anyway, but they sort of made the shortcut. That they weren't. It wasn't so much that taking in this knowledge was a bad thing; it's that they did it too early, and
Mm.
um, they hadn't prepared their wills to be able to accept this new thing, basically.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad you landed there because I feel like the end there was a good sort of counter to like Satan or the serpent actually being Jesus, being like, hey, like this is the good thing, come seek it out. Because essentially God wanted it as well, but he being all knowing, right? Obviously he knows when on the timeline it should occur. Uh, anyways, the one thing that I took slight issue with was the perfect knowledge bit, because you said eating of the fruit would give more of this perfect knowledge of good and evil, sort of this omniscient. And I've never heard this, but I, that doesn't seem to line up with the knowledge we have as humans, because obviously huge part of the human experience is this level of agnosticism or unknowing, this level of skepticism or just unable to fully confirm knowledge. So I'm struggling with that bit, saying that the knowledge of good and evil actually gave us this omniscient knowledge.
Well, I think that a lot of that knowledge was lost over time, right? Like generationally, it wouldn't have survived. But I think Adam and Eve did essentially have this kind of omniscience that maybe wasn't
Mm.
perfectly given down to like sons. And of course, there's the doctrine of the flood, of course, where I'm imagining a lot of that knowledge would have been lost. And we could get into a lot when it comes to that. Uh, but
I'm sorry to interrupt, but wait, I for some reason I was assuming that you didn't actually think these stories were historical, because I know there's a lot of Christians who view these as historical, and then there's some who view them as sort of true mythology, in the sense that they're stories about God's nature interacting with humans in a true way, but they're not necessarily historical. So you actually do think that the Garden of Eve was historical, as well as like flood and Moses and everything?
kind of, but not necessarily in like the blunt, direct way. Like here's an example. in the book of Genesis, you know the story about how like God supposedly made the world in 7 24-hour days? Well, where that idea comes from is that for 6 of the 7 days it says, and then there was evening and there was morning the first day, right? And this is even before the sun was invented, right? Which would have came around about the 4th day, supposedly. Now, there's a couple of things to be said about that. One is that when we're talking about the beginning of the universe, where time itself seems to be coming into being, given what we know about things like general relativity and all that sort of stuff, it doesn't surprise me if maybe time gets a little bit strange at the beginning of time, right? But not only that, I don't actually think that the purpose is to say 7 24-hour days. I don't think that at all. Because when it says there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day, first day, all that sort of stuff, it says for the sorry, someone's coming in.
Well, I guess this is a good time to shill a little bit, at least to just say that anyone who's listening, please hit me up. My email's in my description and everything, as well as the Discord, because I'm always looking for anyone to talk to, regardless of what you think. So,
Yeah, sorry about all that. I just
no worries. I'm fine.
talk to it. But as I was saying, when it says that there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day, 5th day, and all that, the word day, and it's even used this way in Genesis, right? So this isn't me just being like a liberal or something, liberal in the theological sense, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The word day can mean age or like any span of time. It's a very vague term where it can mean like 24 hours, or it can mean like daytime, or it can mean like an age like the day of Elijah or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
And so what I actually believe that Genesis is actually saying there is that each of there was evening and there was morning. It's actually giving not just a beginning story, but also a prophecy that the age of, for example, light and darkness beginning and ending, like there's actually a time limit to these things being the case. So, like, for example, on the first day, he says, let there be light, and there was light. And so it's separated from the darkness. I think that there is a time limit where at some point, light, in the sense of like photons and stuff, will no longer exist. And that's what it means by it was morning. Like it will come to an end. And it even says as much in the book of Revelations, where it says there is no sun or moon and there is no need of light for the Lord their God. Like we will actually know, like in the same way that we know things, we know where things are like spatially because of like photons giving us that information. The very logos itself will replace that. And to sort of support that view, when we actually get to the Sabbath where God rests, it doesn't actually say there was evening and morning the 7th day. It doesn't end, because the idea is that God's rest, God's Sabbath, is eternal. There's no beginning and end to that age. And as a sort of additional bit of support for that, there's somewhere I believe it's in Isaiah, where he says, I declare the end from the beginning. Now, if you look at the Hebrew word he uses, he says, I declare the end from the Reshit, which is what they called the book of Genesis in Hebrew. That's what it's called in Hebrew, the Reshit, which means the beginning. And so he's basically saying, I declare the end of all things from the very beginning. So again, when it says like there was evening, so like when he says, I created the moon, the sun, and the stars, there was evening and morning the 4th day. There's going to be a beginning. There was a beginning to these things, and there will be an end to these things. God will put an end to the sun, the moon, and the stars. That's what I believe is the point of the book of Genesis. So do I believe these things are literal and that they're historical in a sense? Yeah, but not in the most clear-cut way that's like the like the obvious plain reading of the text necessarily. In the same way, for example, when God even says in Genesis, that day you will die, it seems to be that they live a little bit longer after that. But there is a sort of spiritual sense in which they die, because the Christian has two views of death. There's the first death and the second death. And there was the introduction of death into the world because of what Adam had done and everything like that.
So, um, with Adam and Eve specifically, I guess when I'm asking historically, like, in our historical narrative, what we've built in the natural world about human evolution and all this stuff, um, do you think that it actually just started with these two people, or are they just sort of a like representation of God's creation, and we didn't necessarily all just evolve out of them?
Well, that's the tricky thing because I mean, my personal view is that they were two literal people. But that the view that they are meant to be a representation is defensible in the sense that
Mm.
their names are literally humanity and life.
Yeah,
Like Adam means humanity, Eve
yeah,
means life. Or actually, Eve doesn't mean life, means mother of all, but she had a name, life, before that. So
mm.
Eve actually had a different name before and after the fall. Um,
Well, and even if, because like I'm not even taking the full blown mythological step here, right? Which I think that that's probably what the Old Testament was, in my opinion. And I know there's a lot of scholarly debate about this. I don't really know who's right, but I don't even think you'd have to take the full mythological leap to say that Adam and Eve were real and maybe even were the first two humans created by God. um to then but like, I mean, God could just make more people still, right? I mean, even after they get kicked out of, so because just the problem I have is that for me it does not seem rational for all of humanity to evolve out of Adam and Eve. To me that's just, well, and I guess again the flood, it wasn't even all of humanity now, but even just one family like Noah's family. um yeah, I I guess that's the problem I have with it.
well, there's something to be said about that because even in the book of Genesis, when you get to the story of Cain, there's only supposed to be four people in four, four people in all existence by that stage. There's Cain and Abel, and then there's Adam and Eve. That's all that was born at so far. And yet, after Cain slew his brother, there seems to be other people other than just Adam and Eve. There seems to be
Right.
like a whole community. There seems to be
Yeah.
a bunch of people. Now, it's possible because like the way Adam was made, he was made from the dust of the earth. And then the way Eve was made was that God used the genetic material from, it says from his rib, but it really translates to from his side.
Mm.
So it's not like necessarily even like a small portion. They could have literally cut him in half, kind of thing. Um, it's entirely possible God did that multiple times. That he basically put Adam to sleep and just made like a bunch of people, and maybe Eve was just one of them who was meant to be like
Yeah.
a helper. And helper here doesn't even necessarily mean like, we can get into the whole gender discussion of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean like servant or slave because even God is called a helper. It's the same
Mm.
word, and so
Yeah.
it's not like it's like a cooperative thing. Um, but yeah, like there seems to be other people by the time
Right.
Cain is wandering the earth as a vagabond.
And
So it's
obviously
like,
this is all
well,
speculative and stuff, and I don't expect you to like actually have an answer, but I think that you guys as people who engage in reasonable theology about your beliefs and stuff, I do think that yeah, there should be a better answer maybe to something like that, or at least I just, again, in my experience there's so many people who just say yeah, like that's how it is, like it was Adam and Eve and everyone evolved from that, and it's like they don't take that step to, again, this isn't on you, sorry if it's coming across that way, but I want the broader narrative to change so that like these evangelicals can fucking get behind like evolution and stuff. Like it's just, it's a tiresome battle, and it goes back to the academia thing, right? The education thing, and how we can't actually get down these better forms of human societies without better education and stuff. So yeah, it is something I'm passionate about, I guess. I Time is going quick. I sort of want to have an out at 10 probably at the latest, or in a half hour, I guess. So there's more I want to talk to you about. However, did you think of any questions that maybe you would like to push me on or question me about?
I guess I am curious because you mentioned, for example, Gnosticism and that sort of thing. I guess I'm curious what your perspective is. So um, what's your view of religion? I guess
Um,
just as a broad.
well, I guess historically for me, it just is intertwined with language and us interacting in societies together and cultures together. And so, because of these interactions, we start speaking and coming up with words to describe things. And then, especially because we're not fully developed intellectually or scientifically, technologically, or anything, we start to describe things that are very mysterious to us and unknown to us. Uh, and so we start coming up with concepts like gods and other things like that. It's sort of like, it sounds like you've read a little bit of Hume. He kind of talks about the historical standpoint of religion as sort of evolving out of this primitive way of like engaging with the land, and like now we're saying, oh, water sustains us, so like water has sort of this deity attached to it because it gives us life, right? We're describing these things that sustain us through supernatural descriptors. um but uh this is, and by the way, even this doesn't take away from like the one true God, right? This is just a purely descriptive of how humans came up with the language and the structures for religion. Like, you still could view this as God exists, but let his creatures sort of explore and come up with it, right? And then you get into Platonism, stuff like that, where they're talking about the good, the one thing, the forms that are out there. And I think this is where that really paired with Christianity, taking like Platonic reasoning and dialogue to develop the religion more. Islam was very much influenced by a lot of Aristotelian thought. So yeah, we're just sort of compiling all this human knowledge, religious, philosophical, scientific, but I don't believe in God per se. It's really complicated because I'm not your standard atheist. So I don't usually call myself that anymore. I just say I'm like a naturalist, but I definitely don't believe in like capital G God, creator, omniscient guy.
Mm. So I guess if I had to ask for like what would be your biggest objection to that kind of capital G God sort of view, what would be your maybe top two objections?
Top two. Well, the first one, it's only relevant if you think God wants a personal relationship with his creation, which most people do, I think, especially most Christians. I was certainly raised that way. And so the argument is sort of informally or formally called divine hiddenness, I guess, because
Mm.
as a genuine seeker of knowledge, I study philosophy, I study religion, I have prayed many times, read scriptures, and then prayed. I've done my my due diligence, if you want to say, for lack of a better, and not even that. Outside of that, like as an atheist, I have pursued virtue, pursued trying to be a moral person, right? And virtue, because I'm sort of a virtue ethicist, and it actually lines up fairly well with sin, right? Like, I think greed's bad. I think licentiousness is bad, right? Like, I try to avoid these things that hinder the like meaningful version of being a human, which again generally line up with what Christians call sin. So all of that to say that I don't think I don't either God doesn't want a connection with me specifically. You could say that I'm doing it wrong, but again, I've approached this many different ways and have genuinely open-heartedly searched for things like this. Um, and yeah, I haven't been able to connect the dots to that relationship, I guess. So yeah, do you want me to do another one,
Well,
or do we want to just stick there?
I reckon sticking there would be all
Okay,
right.
cool.
Because I guess I would have to ask, like, you say that because I don't like, even if I did, I have no real place to judge your integrity, right? Like, I'm not going to sit
Hmm.
here and say you probably did it wrong. Like, that's not for me to judge, right? But
Yeah,
what my question really is like, what what exactly are you looking for? Like how would you know what criteria do you have of like how would you know if you had actually found what you were looking for? Like what's the what exactly are you looking for, I guess?
I guess that's part of the problem, right? And it's probably going to relate to faith. And me as someone who tries to practice just like reasoning and stuff, I struggle with the faith bit. But I think the questions I don't really know what I'm supposed to be looking for. Uh, I've done the readings, like right. I've like prayed how I was taught and other techniques. I guess I should just ask you, what should I be looking like? What should I expect to find?
Well, there's a couple of different answers. Like some of it could be experiential. Like obviously, if you did have an experience of like the Holy Spirit or something, that would certainly be something. I question, however, if like that's necessary for every Christian. I don't know if
Hmm.
every single saved person absolutely has to have had um, like an unambiguous experience of the Holy Spirit kind of thing.
Right.
And I do know that like I mean, it even mentions it so in the Bible that it's given in different doses, sort of thing. Like there's a story of like of Moses. Yeah, I think it's in the Book of Numbers, and there's also a prophet Miriam and some other guy I can't remember. And basically, God says like he talks to Moses face as if face to face, but with Miriam, it's more like he talks in riddles, kind of thing. Um, I guess I would have to ask, like, because I mentioned earlier before, for me, God is the ultimate conception of freedom, and I don't mean that in like a metaphorical sense, like the real God was freedom, or the whole lot, or something like that, like not in like a Spinozian sense. I mean that God is like a living, conscious being who is also the living embodiment of freedom and truth and love and all that sort of stuff. I guess for me, I would have to find freedom. I would have to find truth, and I would have to find love. That would certainly, at the very, that wouldn't be exhaustive, but that would be on the list.
Yeah.
Um, I yeah, I'll let
Well,
you finish. Sorry.
quick side note, and hopefully it doesn't derail it too much. But are you like sort of a Platonist in the sense that God just contains all these things like truth, beauty, freedom? Like, does he contain like the perfect version of these things?
Not in the platonic sense, because in
Okay.
the platonic sense, it's more like the form of something. I just view it as more, you could call it a property. I do believe in
Of God.
universals, kind of, but it's not quite in the platonic sense, and it's not quite in the Aristotelian sense. Um,
Hmm.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Again, I don't want to. I was just curious about that, but
yeah,
um, yeah. In fact, what you've just described, I believe I found through a multiplicity of human knowledge. Uh, I've studied a lot of Taoism, which I really like a lot. And in fact, I don't like calling myself that because I feel like it's way too culturally appropriative because they actually have a religion over there called Taoism, and I'm just engaging with the philosophy. But I like a lot of it. Sort of why I just refer to myself as a naturalist. Um, but and that's only one example, right? I love Plato. I feel like I have found a lot of truth in Plato, and not only truth, but tools for discovering truth, namely dialogue, right? Engaging in such a way with people that we can come to these things together if we do it correctly, which, you know, maybe it's no news to you, but like the mainstream sucks at this. This is probably another reason why our academia sucks. Like it's all about the grift, the dunk, the debate, like who's right. It's all sophistry to me. This is like genuine. We're actually trying to discover something
yeah.
here, right? Um, so yeah, I would say I do think I've found those things, but it's not just through Christianity, though Christianity is a huge part of it. Obviously, being raised as LDS, I was raised with a version of Christ that was like the most loving. Like, you are supposed to embody Christ and be like this to everyone you meet. Um, So there is that sense of Christ in me still, but it's not the only thing, I guess. I feel like I've just collected a lot of different pieces from all over.
Well, I mean, I've always said that like all truth is God's truth, right? So like, even if you you know, find something that's like useful in Taoism, because I mean, I study a lot of philosophy. Um, I've gotten a lot out of David Hume. Um, Even though he's an atheist philosopher, he's one of my favorites. I think obviously I
Hmm.
disagree with him on a lot of stuff, but there's a lot that he has to say that I found extremely valuable, right? Um, I don't think that as a Christian, like we're necessarily supposed to ignore that. I mean, there is a certain claim of exclusivity that is in the religion for sure, but that doesn't necessarily negate what is good in a lot of these other religions. It sort of just contextualizes it a bit. I mean, it sounds to me, even like with yourself, like you say that you appreciate Taoism, but it sounds to me you don't fully commit to Taoism. There might be
Mm-mm.
some, yeah. So there's like some aspects of Taoism that you might hold back on, right? For example, that's pretty much how the Christian would prescribe you. It's just that obviously there would be, hopefully, if you were to become a Christian, it would be a kind of a full commitment to a kind of Christian ethic and a kind of Christian uh, kind of approach to philosophy and things like that. Um,
Yeah.
I guess in terms of the whole divine hiddenness thing, um, I would say like the- it gets into a very deep conversation. It's difficult to have with like each individual person. But one thing that I would ask, just as a broad area of curiosity, is like if God was to show up to you right now, right this second, like just appear behind you in as we're talking, and Jesus is like, "Yo, what up? I'm here." What would your reaction be to that? Would
Um,
you see that as a kind of like, oh, I guess I have to give up some freedoms now. Oh no, I guess I'm gonna have to become a Christian. Would there be a kind of pull towards something you don't want to do, or would you view it as a joyful, elated thing where it's like this is the one who grants me my freedom kind of thing? Like, what would your reaction be?
yeah, I think so long as for me as the experiencing being here was able to certainly, and I don't have, not even to 100%, like I don't have to have the full 100% knowledge that this was a real intervention with Jesus, but it's sort of would have to play into my intuitive and reasoning, like, okay, this is real. Like, as long as I had that sense of like this very much is real, absolutely I would like, yeah, join the fold, I guess. Like, it would be, there's actually a rapper, I love a line he says, his name's Hobson, but he does this rap where he's sort of like angry at God and he's like in the desert, like, you know, kind of talking about this type of stuff. But he has this line about like, if I can't remember exactly, sorry, I'm gonna slaughter it, but basically it's like, if you like made this clear to me, I wouldn't take another step unless it was in the name of you, right? There would be no hesitation from that moment forward.
So so for you, is the issue of God, is it more of a, is it an epistemic? So I guess the question I would have to ask is like, is it an epistemic thing, right? In terms of, is it just a question of like uncertainty with knowing him? Like, is it this actually legit, or is it like maybe a moral issue of like, um, why is God not showing himself to me? He should be like, is it? Does
I
that
think
make
it's
sense? Like
both. I
the,
think it's a little of both, right? Like, I think a little bit I feel hurt by it, right? Because if I'm supposed to have, like, relationships are two-way streets. And my whole life as a child, even, I felt like it's been one way, right? Obviously, you can argue, like, and I was a shithead back in the day. Like, I've had a lot of problems. Like, I was very sinful and still, like, as a virtue ethicist, I don't follow virtues perfectly. Like, it's right, something I think everyone's working on. I think you'd probably agree with that. But yeah,
I think a bigger problem is being the virtue ethicist. I'm only joking. I'm just messing. I am a consequentialist, but I do. Uh, I,
What?
I'd love to have a
You're
debate with you about that.
wait, you have to be like a realist though, like an objectivist, right?
Yeah, I
Okay.
believe.
By the
Yes,
way,
yeah.
I'm very complicated with my, again, it all goes to like a pluralistic lens for me. I'm not strictly a virtue ethicist. That's just an important factor in my moral system. So I'm not just strictly like this is the way, the truth, the light, right? It's just a big piece of it. Um but yeah, anyway, so a little bit is that kind of hurt or moral thing that you brought up, right? It's like why would I engage in a one-way relationship if it's continuously one way? And I wanted to say this too, like I don't think I'm requiring or expecting some huge divine like or like some doubting Thomas well, not doubting Thomas, the Paul experience on the road to Damascus, right? Like I wouldn't expect God would have to do that for me, right? There's probably many things God could do. Maybe he's doing it by the fact that I'm seeking out Christians like you to talk to, and actually he's doing it through me because he knows I have to convince myself. I don't know, right? Maybe over time that's how it's gonna happen for me. Um, but like I don't know. I feel like it's pretty obvious that I'm open to it, and I think a lot of people just assume that atheists aren't. Um, but then the other aspect is the knowledge, the epistemic portion, right? And because I'm somewhat like I'm not a hard skeptic or anything, but like I do hesitate just believing things, especially from faith. Um, you know, obviously I trust things. Like trust to me is different than faith. Like trusting my partner to do what they tell me they'll do, whatever. Like that's to me that's different than faith because I already have this prerequisite experience with my partner or whatever. Um, so yeah,
I guess to address that, right? I wouldn't take it personally, first of all, in the sense that God doesn't show up in like the obvious. Obviously, you mentioned you're not necessarily looking for that exactly.
right.
Um, and of course, I don't expect you to have an exact detailed picture of he has. In fact, it would actually be bad if you did. Like he has to do this, and then I expect this. And like obviously, it's you seem to have a reasonable expectation, I would think. I guess it's more that like if God is the living embodiment of freedom, as I mentioned before, right? You mentioned that relationships are a two-way street, 100%, but like there's a bit of a difficult quandary, isn't there, in terms of like if God is the most powerful being in the universe, how do you have a freeing relationship with a being like that? Because if that being was to show up in your life right now, you'd kind of have to do everything that that being
Mm.
said, right?
I
Almost in
wouldn't take
seemingly
another
purely
step
by
if it wasn't in the name. Like I already said it, right? Yeah.
yeah. But the question is, there's a big difference in not taking another step in the name of the Lord out of fear versus love, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if God wants this to be a legitimate uh, a relationship, it has to be one that is freely chosen by you. And so if there's a kind of coercion that might come about if God just not in all cases. Again, I take this on a consequentialist kind of basis,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's going to be
Right.
it depends on the situation, but
Because
there
he's
could be
obviously
a
done it in
potential.
the past, right?
Yeah, 100%. And even then, when he has done it, there has been that leap of faith a lot of times before that. Like when Jesus showed up to a lot of his disciples, at first he just showed up as if he was just like an ordinary looking dude, and he says, "Come follow me," and they did. You know, only after that does a lot of this stuff get revealed to them and that sort of thing. Um, but even so, right? When we talk about faith, right? So, like this idea that you're expected to have faith, maybe we should have a talk about what that actually means. Because when I talk about faith, I certainly don't mean like a willful ignorance, right? Where you forgo reason and you just throw yourself blindly at something. I don't mean that necessarily. What I do mean is that it's actually kind of involved in the process of learning, right?
Yeah.
That whenever you're pioneering into something new, whenever you're discovering something new, if it's new, then by definition, you don't have the best map for the territory, right? It's something that you've never experienced before, which means you're stepping into a whole new world where in which you don't have a lot of you don't have your bearings, you don't have a lot of touchstones to rely on. It's inherently a dangerous new thing, which because it's new, you can't know what you're getting into. The very act of figuring out what is there is something that requires you stepping into the unknown, as it were. And so, I guess my prescription would be um, if there's something in your life that's maybe a bit of an unknown, I guess, in terms of maybe it literally just is the epistemic thing, which might literally just be it. Taking that step of like how do I know like what can there be? How do I know that there is a God? All right. And you could literally just be as something as simple as studying the resurrection, the historical arguments for the resurrection, studying all these different arguments for God, which ones fail, which ones succeed. What are the means by which you are supposed to know God? And because you mentioned before being a naturalist, I would sort of say that there's a tendency for those who hold a naturalistic worldview to engage in a kind of thinking that's a little bit too categorical, that is kind of doesn't allow them to be. I'm not saying this is necessarily you specifically, it's just my
Yeah.
experience talking to a lot of people who are, yeah, it's there's a potential danger for like well, let's even talk about Hume, for example, because we mentioned Hume. Hume had this argument against miracles that like miracles are something that are unlikely almost seemingly by definition. With things that are, for example, like lies or being deceived tends to happen more often, right? And so you got to reject the greater miracle, right? And I agree with him in principle. It's just that there seems to be almost an assumed, almost a priori kind of idea that miracles should be thought of as less likely by definition,
And they
right?
just
And it could
can't
be something as
happen.
simple as that.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah,
it's a
they're not a
good
part of the
point.
natural world.
It's a good like I've even had someone tell me that like naturalism's unfalsifiable in the sense that even if Jesus appeared to you, a naturalist would be like, well, there has to be, this is just a natural thing happening, right? So I do think there are flaws with naturalism, and yeah, um, but for me, by the way, I don't like categorizing. I understand that we need to do it for pragmatic purposes to live and engage with each other and everything, but this is where the very much more Eastern thought comes out of me in like Buddhism and Taoism. For me, it's just one. There's just a thing. There's one entire thing. We're here with our intellect cutting it up into pieces. So
Mm.
I think a miracle could happen, right? But it would just be uncalculatable. It would be unexplainable. There'd be no coherent way for me to like relay the message of a miracle, in my opinion, right? And this is the I think the mysticism bit a little bit, right? And sorry, I feel like I'm unloading a lot right now, but there's also a second problem I have with specific religions rather than just God as God. Um, so the I guess I'll just get into that. I don't necessarily have a problem with this God substance or whatever, right? So the mysticism bit is just like there's something to connect to that maybe can't be put into words. We can't just like make a religion out of it, but there's this experience and it changes you. It makes you want to be better. It makes you want to do whatever. Um, and if there is a God to me, that's what it is. Because I've had experiences like that. Mostly they've been with drugs, so take it or leave it. But they're meaningful and they've changed my life for the better, to be a better person and care about people more, care about myself more. So say what you will about the drug aspect, but um, to me, like the problem I have with Christianity specifically is that this God substance is telling us that we're just all broken to begin with, right? And that we require outside source, namely Christ, to be killed in the name of our salvation, right? Rather than, no, we are just part of the divine system itself. We're just part of it. Like to me, like, why isn't just this enough? The fact that we're existing, operating in a system, and that we're enough, that we have the capability to connect to that system and like better it and better ourselves. So yeah, and same, and it's not just Christianity, right? I think a criticism in each religion in that case. That's just the Christian specific one.
Yeah, I do empathize with that a bit because I actually did look into things like Buddhism, for example. And when I first got into that sort of stuff, this was before I fully became a Christian. Um, I was very much pantheistic, and I had a very similar sort of view. Um, and I definitely thought that, for example, we could sort of have this kind of connection by our own strength and by our own good living. However, I kind of came to a problem, and it's a bit of a it's almost a mathematical problem. It sounds a bit almost nerdy, but basically it kind of comes down to the idea that if you accept, so there's two possible conclusions that you could go down. One is that we human beings are distinct from God in some way, even if there's still a connection, like a connection and a separation at the same time. And if you maintain that, then that sort of means that, well, okay, here's the question. Are you a finite being? And if you're a finite being, how is it even possible in principle for you to have a relationship with an infinite being, right? Like, for example, let's take enlightenment. If enlightenment is this sort of infinite goal that's like at the end of the road, now, no, that's not how Buddhism talks about it. It's not so much something that's over there; it's kind of already
Yeah,
there because the distinctions and all that. But
right.
that's the other version I was going to get into. But if you do maintain those distinctions, right, that you are finite and that this infinite, this God substance, as you put it, is infinite, how do how do you have a connection with that? How do you, as somebody who is good but in a finite way, how do you have a connection with somebody who's infinitely good? How many good things do you have to do until you become infinitely good? Well, it kind of becomes this issue that if you start off as finitely good, no amount of good things you can do would ever get to that infinite. It's like trying to count to infinity.
Mm-hmm.
The only way you could get there is if that infinite being sort of adds infinity to you in a sense, right? So he kind of gives that goodness to you, and that's essentially exactly what Christianity is all about. This idea that God, this infinite being, attributes grace to you and gives you this thing that you could never have from yourself, and is the source of the goodness that you will eventually experience in heaven. Now, of course, if you take the more hardcore Buddhist pantheistic view, it's more like, hang on a minute, these distinctions you're making, they don't fly, right? It's kind of this idea that everything is one. And if have you read, for example, the Parmenides?
Uh, it's been a while, but I've read some fragments. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite dialogues. It took me like 3 different reads to actually get it, right? But there ends up being like this kind of self contradiction that is
Mm-hmm.
entailed in this idea of everything is one, because that like it reduces the very notion of difference, right? The very
Right.
notion of difference keeps collapsing and collapsing into the point where like even you couldn't even say the one has being, because the in order
Right.
for the one to have being, it would have to be one, and it would have to be have being, which means it would be two.
Yep. And this is, honestly, this is, it's hard to put. I feel like we're so used to thinking in non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, that it's really hard to like talk about it and describe it. But yeah, that is it. Like, because there is one, it like, for something to be, basically something has to not be, and it's like it is the contradiction that is creating being. uh and that wasn't a good way to put it. Again, it's super hard to describe.
No, I like it. But
Well, and like this is like very much Taoist and some Buddhism that kind of merged with Taoism, called Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism. But it is this like notion of complete nothingness, complete absence is the sort of uh originator of present, of being, right? Um yeah, it's too much to get into the actual like reasoning behind it, yeah, I agree with you. It leads to this like contradiction, but I'm starting to think that maybe contradictions are just another instrumental tool we use in our language, but literally nothing exists in a vacuum. Like we can't isolate anything. It is all interconnected in some way to the entire system itself. So the way we categorize things ultimately doesn't make that much sense.
I think there's definitely like I'm not as much of a classical logician as like for example, I don't think the law of non-contradiction applies outside of time and space. And we could go into the reasons why. It's usually because like Aristotle formulates it as a contradiction is A and not A in the same respect at the same time. So you can literally just pass this view out by saying, well, there's no time in the one, because that's another thing you're adding to it, right? So you could still pass that out. It's not so much that it becomes self-contradictory that's the problem. It's that it kind of becomes unknowable, doesn't it? It
Mm.
becomes kind of inaccessible, and
Oh
that's where they
yeah,
sort of brings in that mysticism you mentioned,
that's and yeah.
right?
Thank you
But
for
I
saying
think
that.
that
Because sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to sort of finish by saying within the Christian religion, Christ becomes knowable. God becomes knowable. Not in his entirety. You don't know everything about God, but you can at least grab the hem of his garment, right? You like in order to have a relationship with something, you have to at least know it by knowledge, at bare minimum. And so it seems to me that the notion of divinity and the system that you describe, there's a kind of disconnect
Mm-hmm.
almost. There's a cutting off where it's like that's over there and unknowable, but it's also in me, and now I'm unknowable, and it makes almost everything unknowable. But like within Christianity, because God does come down, and he needs to come down in order for him to be knowable, right? You can't know God purely through a syllogism. You can't solve God like he's times tables in your head. There's even a part in the Bible where Paul shows up in Athens, and they've got this statue to the unknown God. You probably heard this story, right? Where they've got the statue to the unknown God, and Paul says, "I will make this God known to you," right? And it kind of becomes this idea that the only way God could be known at all is if in some way he steps into time and he steps into our world and talks to us. He has to reach out to us in order for us to know him. We can't just grab out and pull him down here. And I feel like the reason that's why I like Christianity, because a lot of religions are either the attempts of either trying to pull God down here, or they sort of let him up there, but now we can't
Mm-hmm.
know him.
Yeah.
And my view is that Christianity is the only religion that solves that problem for me.
Well, and I actually think you're right to a degree. And maybe it's just a difference in personality and attitudes and how we operate in the world, but I think it makes more sense that we actually cannot pinpoint down the ultimate, right? Because I mean, even you said we can only like grab his garments, right? There really is no way for us finite beings to pinpoint the infinite. And in fact, most of our endeavors to do so are probably just futile. I mean, even if you're correct, you have one out of how many theological systems or philosophical out, it makes sense to me that we can't really grasp that. To me, it doesn't make me nihilistic about it though. It makes me empowered to um I guess continue the like search. And it's not a search to reach infinite. It's not a search to be omniscient or know everything. It's a search to have just a little inch more. Like
Yeah.
we're sort of building ourselves to. And the other aspect of it too is like, what does infinite imply? Like there's no end. It just continues. Obviously it's a hard concept to grasp in general, but like you said something a second ago that if we're finite beings, like how do we keep getting better if the good that we're seeking is infinite, right? How do we match our good to the infinite good? And I think that makes sense for this like journey that I'm saying. We're part of the system. We're part of the infinite part of it. And
Mm.
our role in such is to continue being like there's a lot of Taoist writings that essentially are just like, yeah, like go like just be in nature, like just like essentially just go be what you're designed to be, just like live and be a part of the system that you're living in, right? Because there's a level of infiniteness that we can't grasp, and like sort of our role in this system is to just live in it and exist. um and I think discover truths about it, right? That's where I'm not so nihilistic. I think part of our nature as humans, part of why we are the way we are, is because we want to seek truth and discover meaning.
But I think you sort of touched upon, because remember when we asked, like, what is it that you were looking for to know if you found God? I think we might have found out like what the criteria might be, though, right? What I think you're correct me if maybe I'm taking too much of a step. What I think you're looking for maybe is how could I knowingly have a relationship with God such that you do have that stable grasp of um, like you actually have a relationship with the infinite. Like, how do you justify that view in your mind that the infinite does, in not entirely, but in some way, become knowable? Um, because, for example, this is like, for example, if I've had a lot of debates with people who believe in Islam, for example, and in Islam, there's a very strong principle that God is transcendent. He doesn't become
Hmm.
incarnate in our world, and nothing in creation is like Allah, right? So nothing in creation can actually tell you anything about what Allah is really, really like. He's just
Hmm.
that transcendent. But the problem I point out within Islam is that, like, okay, if nothing in creation tells us about Allah, well, then you've got, like, for example, the Quran, right? Like, that seems to be something in creation. Like, the Quran would seem to be just as much of an idol as if you drew Muhammad's face or something.
Hmm.
It's a creation which is using material things to depict something about the divine.
Right.
So is language, it's all part of it. And
Yeah.
so they have that kind of disconnect that I mentioned. What I think you need to sort of seek out specifically is that, okay, what kind of worldview allows me, maybe at least just to begin with, right? What kind of worldview allows me to be able to seek out the thing that I'm even looking for in the first place? What kind of worldview allows that to even be possible?
Yeah.
My critique would be, it seems impossible under Taoism to have even sought the thing in the first place, because even the very notion of you seems to be an illusion. Like, the distinctions that cut you out from the rest of the universe are themselves an illusion, and you are being fooled by that illusion, which is itself also part of the one. So there's a kind of like
Well,
it's a bit confusing for me,
yeah.
but
So just this makes it a little complicated because like I told you before, I'm very pluralistic, right? So I'll just like be pulling concepts from all over, and then like suddenly I'm a Taoist, or like suddenly I'm a Christian because I said that, like, so I'm not, yeah, it's not that I just like fully buy into the Taoist system, and but the way you described like the illusion thing, that to me is more like of a Buddhist outlook, and I don't like a lot of Buddhism. Um, though there are pieces that I at least appreciate learning about. Because that's the whole everything's illusory, right? Like there is nothing. We're seeking this extinguished. This is what I don't like. I don't like that we're seeking nirvana's just extinguishing ourselves. Like that that's to me it's just nihilistic. Like I enjoy systems that make me like this life. And again, this is another this sorry, that's a little side trail, but just another little critique of religion in general. It just seems like the goal is to exit this life and join someone in heaven or wherever it may be, right? Like my system is just focused on this, like being here in this living. Um and the way I connect to like this infinite or whatever, right, is it's because I am part of it, right? Like I already am connected to it. It's not that it's not transcendent, like it's right here, I'm part of it. So yeah, I get what you mean. I won't be able to omnisciently know, metaphysically speaking, every corner of the infinite substance that is the system, but I know pieces of it, and I can like even just through experience and learning and reading philosophies and all this stuff, like I am learning about it. I mean, science is a good example, right? We're learning to literally predict and manipulate matter and do things. So you can say we could be the ultimate Hume skeptic, or sorry, he wasn't as bad as Descartes. He was actually a more rational skeptic, but we could like go ahead and say, well, how do you know that that's actually true about the infinite system? Which is fair. Like that skepticism's there for everybody, but the way we are learning and operating in the world is informing how we continue to do it in the future. It's progressing, it's shaping, we're building this knowledge, and we're like living better because of it.
Yeah, I guess that's not necessarily negated under my view. I mean, I guess I would say I would agree to an extent. It's just that we'll look at like we talked at the very start of this about a lot of anti-intellectual trends we've been noticing, right?
Mm.
So we agree that like those kinds of trends would take you away from the infinite. Like if there was such a thing as moving towards it, that's not it.
Yeah. But this is where and not as a universal thing or whatever, it's not always the case, but I do actually think sort of competition does drive a lot of things. And when it comes to thought and dialogue and everything, there's a place for people to be wrong. And that place is for pushing back on true ideas and allowing the true ideas to get more strength and more reasoning behind what they're talking about. It's sort of this, and that's like the art of dialogue, right? This sort of like back and forth. It doesn't even have to be like me and you could be both slightly wrong in our own ways and slightly correct in our own ways, and here we are combating it to try and like better both of our knowledges together. So yeah, I think that can fit fine under this framework.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe at another time we'd have to have a conversation maybe about because recently I was do you know Calidor in Discord, like in the MDD servers? Have you talked to him?
Oh, it kind of sounds familiar, but I don't, sometimes I'm like on hiatus, and yeah, I'm not always around in the
Well, me and
Discord.
him do a lot of talking, and recently he got me to really um get my head down and start really researching a lot of the historical evidences for like the resurrection of Jesus, for example, the idea that like it actually happened, and I ended up like finding a lot more evidences, like the kind of like I found this one guy, what was his name? Gave Habermas, I think his name was. I can't remember, but he was he talked about because he's a historian and he talked about like the fact, for example, we're pretty sure that this was news to me. I had no idea that apparently we're historically speaking pretty sure that Paul's conversion to Christianity happened somewhere roughly around 330 AD or 36 AD,
Mm.
36 AD, which is like really close to after when Jesus was killed on the cross, sort of thing. And so the idea that we have somebody like that close to the events advocating for this going back. Anyway, it's a whole thing I'd love to talk to you about maybe at another time. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, and sorry, I I actually didn't even realize what time it was, and I was like, I have a hard out at 10, and here we are. Um, I did actually, not a lot of people comment on here, so I love to see when somebody does. So I want to put his comment up. I appreciate this, by the way, Alaska. Like, in fact, if you want to have a conversation with me one of these days, hit me up. You can hit me up on Discord or the email I have. Um, but this honestly is going into exactly like one of the issues I was bringing up with you, right? So he says, "Hello from Alaska, Orthodox Christian. To be dead to the world is to be alive to God." And I know it doesn't mean it in the literal sense, like I shouldn't just like kill myself and go find God, right? But this is these types of frameworks are just antithetical to my mode of being and what I find meaning in. Like, I just for me it's like, why isn't the world enough? Why isn't existence enough? We're we're finding these religious systems and philosophical systems that imply we need to escape this dirty world. Like, we're trying to get to the better place, the good place. This place sucks. Like, we need to be good. We need the grace of God so we can get to heaven. And I don't know. I think that this is enough, and we should just pursue this.
Well, as an anarchist myself, I very much empathize with the view that this life isn't enough, like in terms of the suffering that happens in this life and the amount of evil that, like, as an anarchist, like, even if I was a more secular anarchist, even if I was an atheist, I would still be doing kind of the same thing in a way, like trying to hope for the better life down somewhere that way, where it's like the utopian anarchist vision. Like, I think even if this life, even if I do think there is some good to be found in this life, but I also think that if we're not already in a relationship with the infinite, that by definition means that there's always something more. And so I think that this desire to go for the afterlife, because I hear this a lot, that like it's a very common criticism, and I understand where it comes from. It's this idea that Christianity is all about the next life. What about the here and now?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like, well, the next life is potentially where the infinite is, and the here and now is where we're finite. But it's like you said, the finite isn't antithetical to the here and now, or sorry, the finite isn't antithetical to the infinite, just as the here and now isn't antithetical to the next life. Because what does Jesus tell us to do in order to get to the next life? He tells you to have concern for things that are in this life. Take care of the
Hmm.
widow, the poor, the orphan. He
Yeah.
encourages a kind of communal living. There's lots of things that we can still do here and now that improve the world around us, even if it's a finite amount, but that doesn't take away from our relationship with the infinite. And so we can do
Yeah.
both. God's two
Yeah.
main commandments are love the Lord thy God and love your neighbor as yourself. So yeah, like yeah, that's
Yeah.
yeah.
I totally get that. And I'm gonna say one more thing and then let you have the last word. I'll have to just bite my tongue. But I agree with you. Like, that was a good point. That, you know, even if you're an atheist, sort of the utopia's over here down the timeline, whereas if you're a believer, utopia's like up here, the transcendent. Either way, you have this like ideal version of utopia, something you're trying to we're escaping this timeline to get to the better one, right? We're pursuing this better. So I think that's a good point. Um and I think it goes into like the framework I'm trying to describe, essentially, that like we are pursuing this infinite, but we're never gonna get it. The atheists, I'm sorry, the anarchists, in my opinion, like, there's not gonna be a utopia. The system requires the suffering and the good kind of thing. This is the whole like non-contradiction, right? It's not that like there's just bad and there's just good and they're just siloed, they're two separate things. No, there's only bad because there's good, and there's only good because there's bad, and they're in relation. So you're never just going to have a fully bad or a fully good. It's just this process of developing the way the way you, I guess if you want to be evil, you could pursue that, but and a lot of people do. Um but yeah, I just to say there's a resting point is weird to me. Like, suddenly we all go to heaven, we're all free in this utopia. What are we doing? I That, to me, that sounds like extinguishing again. Like, we're just seeking nirvana.
Well, that's the one wonderful thing about the infinite, is that you never run out of it. It can
But
always be novel.
hmm. Oh, yeah. Sorry. No, no. Go. If you want to say anything else, because I forgot I was supposed to respond.
Oh, that's all good. I was just, yeah, I don't know really how to sign this off. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think it was awesome. Love to talk to you about it again, whether it's
Yeah.
on Discord or even doing this again. Yeah, I think that's I really do think Christ has a lot to offer. I think he is the logos aspect of the infinite, you know, and I think that hope for the hope for the future, whether that future is a secular utopia or in Christ. Like obviously, I think the Christian answer to that hope is the preferred and better alternative, but I still think that having that kind of hope one way or another is extremely important for everyone, and
Mm,
that's what I believe. Among many things, that is one of the things Christ has to offer.
cool. Well, I definitely appreciate you coming. I also enjoyed it. It was awesome. So we'll be in chats, and I'm definitely down to have you on here again or see you around in the Discord. So,
Awesome.
all
I'll,
right.
I'll
Take
catch you
care.
later.
Yep. See you, everyone.